Imagine standing at the altar, heart hammering, every eye in the church on you, and then your future mother-in-law points at your mom and says, "You don't belong here. Leave the church." Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. 167 guests frozen in place. And your fiancé, he just nods. What would you do in that moment? Could you keep your composure? Could you act without breaking down? That was me, Emily Parker, 27, standing in a sunlit church, expecting one of the happiest days of my life. I had imagined walking down the aisle with Ryan, my fiancé, 29, waiting for me with a smile and a hand extended. Everything had been planned meticulously. The flowers, the music, the seating arrangements. Every detail designed for a perfect day. But none of that mattered the second Cynthia Thompson, my future mother-in-law, decided to make a scene. Cynthia was 55, known in the family for her controlling ways and sharp tongue. Her husband, David, 57, was quiet, reserved, and always let her take the lead. And now, in front of hundreds, they had chosen to humiliate my mom. Linda Parker, 52, had raised me to face life with strength and dignity, but even she froze, shocked, caught off guard by the audacity of their command. The church doors seemed to close behind me, the air thick with tension. You could hear a pin drop. The guests whispered, some staring in disbelief, some exchanging nervous glances. I felt a rush of emotion, anger, disbelief, heartbreak, but I couldn't let it control me. Not here. Not now. I glanced at my mom, her eyes wide and pleading, silently asking me to do something, to protect both of us. And then I realized something crucial. I had a choice. I could obey, cry, argue, or I could act in a way they never expected. The kind of action that shifts the balance, even if it terrifies everyone watching. And so I made my decision. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply turned around and walked back down the aisle, leaving them and everyone else stunned. But that moment, that single act, was only the beginning. Because what I did next, in the hours and days that followed, would completely dismantle the world they thought they controlled, and no one saw it coming. All eyes were on us. 167 people, frozen, waiting, watching. And there I was, Emily Parker, 27, standing near the altar, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. My mom, Linda, 52, stood beside me, shocked and silent. And my future mother-in-law, Cynthia Thompson, 55, her hand still raised, radiating authority, had just told her to leave. My fiancé, Ryan, 29, didn't step in. He just nodded. Have you ever been in a moment where your world suddenly turns upside down and every second stretches into an eternity? That was me. The echo of her words lingered in the marble hall. You don't belong here. Leave the church. They weren't just words. They were a challenge, a test, and an insult all in one. And I knew that my next move would define the rest of the day, and maybe even my marriage. The air was thick with tension. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, some staring in disbelief, others holding their phones, probably recording. The murmurs swirled around me like a storm. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, my pulse pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. I looked at my mom. Her eyes met mine, wide and pleading, silently asking me to protect her, to do something, anything. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized I had a choice. I could argue, cry, beg, or I could take control in a way they would never anticipate. Control wasn't about raising my voice, it was about asserting my boundaries and making a statement without losing my dignity. So I did it. I didn't speak. I didn't protest. I just turned. I walked back down the aisle. The sound of my heels on the marble echoed like a drumbeat of defiance. The guests gasped. Cynthia's face went pale. David's joy tightened. And Ryan? He froze. But walking away wasn't the end. It was just the first move in a story they weren't ready to read. And the ripple of what I had set in motion would reach far beyond the church doors. I thought the hardest part was over when I walked back down the aisle, but the real storm was only beginning. The church was silent, but the energy was electric. Guests were whispering, glancing at each other, some clearly shocked, others trying to suppress smirks. My mom, Linda, 52, squeezed my hand tightly, pride and worry mixing in her eyes. She knew I had just taken the first step in reclaiming control, but she also knew what was coming next. Cynthia Thompson, 55, my future mother-in-law, was fuming. Every muscle in her face screamed disbelief. David, 57, her husband, still silent, tried to regain composure but failed. Their carefully orchestrated image of control was crumbling right in front of the 167 guests who had been standing silently, waiting to witness the ceremony. And Ryan, my fiancé, 29, was frozen in the middle of the aisle, suddenly realizing that passivity was no longer an option, and yet, he still didn't move. I could feel the power shift in subtle, exhilarating ways. Every whisper among the guests, every hesitant glance toward Cynthia, reminded me that control is fragile. The people who thrive on intimidation rely on fear and compliance, and once fear vanishes, their influence disappears almost instantly. I had stepped back, and suddenly, they had nothing. But I wasn't done. Even in that moment of chaos, I was already thinking several moves ahead. I had prepared for the possibility of in-laws trying to sabotage the day, minor acts of manipulation, subtle insults, or control over vendors. Quietly, strategically, I ensured that those attempts would be noticed and intercepted. I didn't have to shout, I didn't have to fight, just one deliberate act at a time, and the foundations they had built would begin to crumble. And they did. By the time the wedding coordinator discreetly confirmed arrangements with me, Cynthia realized, for the first time, that she had lost her grip entirely. David's attempts to intercede were futile. And Ryan, finally, looked at me with something resembling awe and perhaps the faintest tinge of regret. But the most satisfying part wasn't just watching them flounder. It was knowing that the ripple of what I had done that morning would continue. That by the next day, everything they thought they controlled would collapse in ways they never imagined. And the next morning, the consequences of my choice became far more than anyone could have predicted. Morning came, but it didn't bring calm. Instead, it brought chaos, and Cynthia and David were the first to feel it. The world they thought they controlled, the perfect image, the flawless reputation, the ability to manipulate everyone around them, was crumbling. Vendors who had been hesitant the day before were now quietly refusing to comply with their instructions unless Emily, 27, confirmed changes. Guests who had been passive were calling to ask questions, quietly supporting the bride and her mother. And every move Cynthia tried to make only revealed her loss of control. I watched it all unfold, Emily Parker, calm but fully aware of the storm I had set in motion. The audacity of walking back down the aisle had been just the first act. Now, the ripple effects were undeniable. Invitations were being questioned, side conversations turned into confrontations, and whispers about past manipulations began to spread. Every carefully planned moment of intimidation Cynthia and David relied on was failing, piece by piece. Ryan, my fiancé, finally spoke. Not loudly, not for the audience, but privately, acknowledging that he had been wrong. That his passivity had allowed his parents to dictate the moment. His recognition was a relief, but it also made me realize something crucial. I had done more than protect my mom. I had shown him what courage, strategy, and dignity truly look like. By midday, the full weight of the fallout hit. Cynthia and David were floundering with relatives, vendors, and guests questioning their every word and action. Their sense of control, which had been their identity for decades, was gone. And I realized a profound truth: power is only as strong as those who accept it. When no one submits, even the most imposing figures are powerless. And while the day continued, the wedding eventually resumed, the atmosphere lighter and freer than ever. But the lesson they learned, the humbling, the shock of seeing their world crumble, it wasn't something they would ever forget. Yet, even as I sat with my mom, reflecting on the events, one question lingered: what would Cynthia and David do next? Because while the morning had ended, the storm they had triggered for themselves was far from over. By the end of the day, everything had shifted. The church, once heavy with tension, was now filled with relief, laughter, and a quiet sense of victory. My mom, Linda Parker, 52, hugged me tightly, shaking with emotion. "You did it," she whispered. "You didn't just protect me, you showed everyone the kind of person you are." And in that moment, I realized the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't about revenge. It was about courage. It was about standing up for what was right, even when everyone else expected me to obey. Walking back down the aisle wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate. Strategic. And in that act, I reclaimed control over my life, my family, and even my future marriage. Cynthia and David, my future in-laws, 55 and 57, were left to process the collapse of the world they thought they controlled. Their carefully curated image, their influence, and their intimidation tactics were all unraveling. Even Ryan, 29, finally understood the reality. His parents weren't infallible, and he couldn't hide behind their authority anymore. The wedding went on, but it was different. It wasn't about satisfying their expectations. It was about celebrating love, family, and respect. Guests who had been unsure, quiet, or even critical began to recognize the strength it takes to act with dignity under pressure. I had turned a moment of humiliation into a defining moment of empowerment, not just for me, but for my mom and anyone watching who understood the courage it took. And here's the lesson I want to leave you with. Power only works if people allow it to. The people who think they can control everything, social status, family, influence, can be toppled by someone who refuses to bend, someone who stands with strategy, patience, and dignity. That day, I became the author of my own story. I didn't just survive the humiliation. I rewrote the rules. So I ask you, what would you do if your world was being challenged in front of everyone? Would you stay silent, or would you take a step that no one expects and change everything? Because sometimes, the quiet, deliberate choices we make have the power to rewrite our entire lives. And for me, walking back down the aisle wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a story that no one would ever forget.